In this tutorial, I cover the polygon subobject level of the Edit Poly modifier. So let's go ahead and create a plane and add an Edit Poly modifier to the plane. Open it up and let's select polygons. So polygons are all these faces or polygons of the geometry. If you have, when you create your original geometry, the number of segments and number of widths, if it's more, you're going to have more polygons. If it's less, you'll have less polygons. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That's true of all the subobjects of the Edit Poly. So let's go ahead and select this. Another thing to keep in mind is each of these has a number, like this is polygon 54, but if you go back in time and change the segments, it's going to increase the number of polygons, so also the number of names and polygon numbers that you have in the geometry. So if I edit one of these, but then I go back and change the plane and the number of polygons in that plane, it might not correspond with where I edited it in the Edit Poly. So once you start manipulating these sub-objects, it's really a good idea just to keep the number of polygons below that modifier the same. Otherwise, it's going to reorient them, renumber them, and you're going to have a really crazy result. All right, so the polygon, Edit Poly, polygon. If we go to the Edit Polygon menu options here, there's quite a bit we can do with Edit Polys. So we could select a few of these. We can extrude them. You can do it by normal or you can do it by local normals. It doesn't really matter with this because they're all facing directly up, but if it's a sphere, for example, you can change it to go with the normal average from the group or the local one or by each polygon. So you can try these different ones and see how they are affected depending on the geometry that you're working with. You can also bevel, so if I'll just keep the same one selected. Same thing here, you have the different options. Let's go ahead and extrude these. Bevel allows you to kind of bevel after you extrude, so that's kind of a nice feature. The next thing we have is inset, so if I select some other ones here, how about I select these actually, and then I inset them, it just creates a polygon that's inset by the other one. So if I do it by polygon, for example. So a good example of group, if I select a few of these, and I go to inset, if I inset each polygon, it insets each one independently. If I select by group, it'll inset all of them as a group. So that's the difference between group and by polygon. Another thing we can do is bridge. So let's say I want to bridge from that polygon to that polygon. It's very similar to bridging in borders, although this one bridges with solid polygons. So I can do bridge. And it creates a bridge between those. You can change the number of segments if you want. You can change the twist and the taper and bulge of all that, depending on what you're looking for. And then this has some new ones which are pretty important. So one is flip. And this is really important if you start to import geometry from other programs and add edit polys to those. Sometimes the faces will have different orientations. So you can tell the orientation based on the brightness of the selection. So if I go to the bottom here, see it's a darker red. That means it's the back of that face. If I go to the top here, it's a brighter red, and that means that's the front of that face. If you have, this can happen sometimes where you have a few of them that are backwards. So if I select all these, you can see all of these are facing up, but I have a few that are facing backwards. So if I select those, you can then flip them so that they have the correct orientation. And that can really cause a lot of problems when you're texture mapping or manipulating geometry. So make sure, you really want to make sure normals are all facing in the correct direction. Next thing you can do is hinge from edge. So if I select this polygon, and let's say I select here the settings, it's going to ask me right here to pick a hinge. And a hinge is an edge. So if I pick that edge, for example, this is the angle of the hinge, and I hinge it around that edge, I can choose a number of segments so you can see this better. You can see it's using that as the center of that hinge. So if I come here and I pick a different hinge, let's say I pick a closer hinge, you see it's going to start rotating around that one. So that's kind of a nice feature. Another one you can do is extrude along spline. So this one requires a line, and it's basically going to take the geometry of the line and use that to extrude a polygon. So if I come over here to my shapes and just draw a quick line over here, we haven't really gone over lines, so I won't get too into it, but one thing you can do with lines, just like Edit Polys, is open them and manipulate the vertices. So you could move these so you know it's a little more precisely where you want it to be. I could actually move these up and down to give it a little more dimension. And the other thing you can do is actually select vertices. So I could select these two vertices, right click on them and actually change the geometry type over here to the point type to a corner, or from a corner to smooth. And you can see that'll then smooth the line through those vertices. So we'll cover that again later, but just want to show you that quick lesson there. Just like Edit Poly, I like to get out of the line before I use it, so I click out there. Use your selection tool, select your Edit Poly again. Let's go back to Polygon. And so now we can select a few of the polygons. Maybe I'll just select these 3, and maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 of these for the fun of it. And we'll go to our Extrude Along Spline. One of the options here is to pick the spline. So I'm going to pick that and then pick the spline. You can see it then extrudes from that polygon, normal to that polygon, the same geometry as the spline, so it follows that geometry. You can change the number of segments if you want to be a little smoother. You can actually taper the geometry and do some of these kind of other features you want. You can do it normal as a group or normal to each of the faces. So that's a really kind of neat feature. And if you start adding, some of the other things we've looked at, like mesh smooth, for example, and I'll just remind you, if you're going to add modifiers after this and you're not animating, if you're just modeling, always click out of the edit polygon before you add a modifier. So in this case, I can add like a turbo smooth. I can smooth that geometry. And you can continue to build on these. So if I turn that off, let's say I add another edit poly modifier, open that up, select polygon. This is now geometry that I can use. So I could come in here, I could select some of these vertices, do another extrude along spline, pick that same spline, and then create a kind of web of different branching geometries just by doing this extrude along spline command.